Okay, so today we are going to talk about three different anatomical systems. We're going to talk about the skeleton in quite, I think, a bit of detail. We're going to talk about the muscular system and in a fairly general way, just looking at a few different parts of the muscular system that I think are important to highlight. And then we're going to talk about the digestive system. And you have to excuse me, my voice is still pretty weak. Um, I've had COVID this week, and it's just really taken a lot out of me. It's been pretty brutal. Um, and so if I sound kind of gruff and if I cough a lot during this, that's what's going on. But the uh, the material for this lecture and the following lecture all come from the Manual of Ornithology, and I have that sitting right here so I can show you. In case this book is is a wonderful book if you're really interested in anatomy. Um, it has really great diagrams. I'm just going to share some of the diagrams with you in this lecture, but um, it's certainly worth getting if you're very passionate about birds and you want to learn more about them from the anatomical perspective, which I think is very valuable. You can get a real picture of the evolution of birds once you start to look at their anatomy, and that's not just true for birds; it's true for all animals. Um, so let's move forward here. Let's start with the skeletal system. So the skeletal system can be broken into two major regions, the axial and appendicular parts of the skeleton. We'll take a look at some diagrams relating to both of those parts of the skeleton. And it shows really three major adjustments across different taxa and in general for all birds. And they're all related to flight. And those are rigidity, the redistribution of mass throughout the body, and various modifications to the limbs for terrestrial locomotion and flight. In general, we talk about uh, pneumatized bones, and so that pneumatization, that hollowing out of the bone, has led there to be the propagation of some misinformation about its function. But it's very intuitive, so it makes a lot of sense as to why this misinformation exists. Uh, a hollow bone is intuitively lighter than a solid bone of the same size. I think that I can say that, um, and all of you will probably agree with me that that intuitively makes sense. But the fact is that that's not really the case in the avian skeleton. In bones that are pneumatized, things like the humerus that you see in this picture, um, a mammalian bone of the same approximate size is the. One second. Okay, well, I just got visited by some students at 8 p.m. at night. They're doing a potluck downstairs, and they brought me a bunch of food. That was very sweet because they said, "Oh, we know you're sick." So, sorry for the brief pause interruption. But back to what we were talking about. We're comparing hollow and non hollow bones of the same size. So, in a bone like a humerus in a bird that's hollow, not all, I should say, not all birds have a pneumatized humerus, but some do. Larger birds, in particular, at least the size of something like a herring gull. In those birds, the bone tissue is denser. So even though it's not a solid bone, there's a lot more bone tissue in the same area, or in a smaller area. So you end up with similar masses between solid and hollow bones. And this is necessary to give these bones the incredible strength they need to have to withstand the pressures of flight. the Some of the things you might notice here in this hollow bone are that it has strut-like features running through it, and they're at different angles, which you can see best in the cross-sectional diagram here, where you see, so this is, imagine taking a cross-section about right here, and you're looking at all these struts running at different angles. Well, these add additional rigidity to that structure, um, and give strength from different angles of pressure. Additionally, on this bone, you might notice this spongy tissue here. This is much more like what you would see in a mammalian bone, spongy tissue with marrow. So birds still have marrow even in hollow bones. That's a necessary part of the skeletal system. But this might all lead you to ask a really quite relevant question then. Why hollow at all? Solid bones, and these bones are of similar mass. Um, I don't know that there's been any tests to prove that one is overall more rigid than the other. I'm not really sure about that. But they're, I think, of relatively similar strength. But then why hollow? Well, the reason for that is because this hollow aspect of the bone creates not a lightness, but a space for something, a space for something that we don't have, that mammals don't have, and that is air sac diverticula, which are just expansions of air sacs. So birds, their respiratory systems that we'll talk about next week, are uh, are situated with a number of air sacs throughout them, and those air sacs reach into these hollow spaces. And so this is primarily an adaptation for those air sacs. I need to check and make sure are we actually recording? Make sure I'm unpaused. Tell me. Okay, yeah, we're good. Awesome. All right. Very good. So that's the sort of generic overview of pneumatization and what it exists for, what its function is. So let's get into some specific examples of things and then start looking at some important structures. In general, you can look at the skeleton of any animal and quickly, most likely, tell something about it by looking at what certain exaggerated features are on that animal. This is a harpy eagle skeleton, and right away, there's probably a few different things that you see pretty quickly that are like maybe odd or they stand out. One of them is the talons. They're these very large talons with stout claws on them and a very curved hallux. That's the rear toe. That's this toe back here. This wickedly curved clawed hallux, because these animals, what they do, these birds, is they crush things with their feet. That's how hawks and eagles and other raptors. That's how they kill stuff. They kill stuff with their feet, not with their faces. The face, the last thing that when you're attacking an animal that could potentially hurt you, the last thing you want to do is put your face right up to its face. Because what's it going to do? It's going to bite you in the face. You might lose an eye. It's going to claw you in the face. That's not really an area that you want to be damaged, especially if you're a bird that strongly relies on your eyes. So, you kill stuff with your feet if you're a raptor. And if you work with these animals, like at a zoo or something, you're going to learn very quickly. The business end of the raptor is the feet. Don't get me wrong. they can give you a good chomp too. You don't really want, I have been, bit by a barred owl before working with one in the field, and it hurt, you know, but I was fine. It hurt. I would have been much more sad if I hadn't been taloned by the barred owl. I have worked with great horned owl before in the field. That's a bird that you really don't want to get taloned by because their strength is absolutely immense, and they can break bones with the pressure of those talons. So uh, you can tell something about an animal just by looking at its skeleton. I can see those big talons on this skeleton. I don't have to see this harp eagle swoop into a tree and rip a primate out of a tree and murder it to know that those talons are an important part of this animal's natural history. Now, there's a harpy eagle. I feel like I can't just show you skeletons and not show you what the bird actually looks like. So here's an obligatory picture of a harpy eagle to go with the harpy eagle skeleton. Here's another interesting skeleton to take a look at. What do we see right away? Well, one thing is it seems to be an upright bipedal posture. Very different looking posture from the harpy eagle skeleton. Another thing is the sternum. It's weird. It's just like blade, but it's like a pyramid blade. And then another thing is the bones of the manus are all flattened. That is, these bones here, bones of the radius and ulna, and then the hand bones, the manus, are all very flat. Well, what the heck would have that? Well, that upright posture automatically. There's just not that many birds that would have a skeleton that really even hinted at a posture like this, except for penguins. So this is an emperor penguin skeleton. um, and then you've got that sternum, which helps give a hydrodynamic shape to the bird, as these are birds that are moving through water. And then the wings, which act to swim, have flattened bones that help increase stability uh, in in their swimming type of flight that they do. And so that's how you end up with this creature here, emperor penguin. If you live, say, in the southeastern United States, would be an example of where you can find this species, and the name of the bird is on the wall, so I can't like make it a surprise for you or anything. You might have seen this bird before. This is an anhinga. They have a hinged neck. They have quite a few cervical vertebrae, and the number of cervical vertebrae does differ in different groups of birds. But they have a bunch of cervical vertebrae, and then between the 8th and the 9th cervical vertebrae, they actually have this hinge joint. And what this creates is this sort of plunging spear mechanism. And so what they do is they sit down in the water, and they're often called snake birds because you can only see their necks. They're kind of curved up out of the water. It looks like a snake moving through the water. And they use their heads to spearfish, and that hinge, everything from the hinge forward to the tip of the beak is the spear, and then so like this part is the spear, and this is what propels the spear forward. They whip this part of the neck forward, and that lunges the spear forward, and they pierce fish with it. That's how they catch fish. Their whole neck is the spearfishing mechanism. This is a very, very cool skeletal adaptation that permits that to happen. And again, you can see that just from looking at the skeleton. I don't need to see the bird do this fishing activity to get a reasonable idea that there's something strange going on. This neck is modified in a way that hints at what it must be using it for. There's not that many other reasons to have a hinge-like apparatus in the neck. I mean, you could probably come up with some wild hypotheses, I suppose. And there's an obligatory picture of an anhinga with its young for uh, for extra zazz. It's a cool picture. Look at this skeleton. Note that the sternum has no blade on it at all. Right away, that's interesting. We haven't talked about why the sternum is bladed yet, but we are going to get to that, and you'll understand it has everything to do with flight. So if it has no blade, what is going on with this bird? What kind of bird would this be? Look at those legs. Those are some stout legs. I mean, uh, man, that femur is thick. It it's clearly a terrestrial bird. It's an emu, is what it is. Um, and note that you don't really see wings because they only have a vestigial remnant of anything even close to a wing. They have like a little nub, and that's all the wing they have. So this is it makes sense. It's a flightless bird, right? It's a flightless terrestrial running bird. And there's our emu. Um, and so you can see the way of the animal in the skeleton. That's really the point of all of this. So let's take a look now at some diagrams of the skeleton. Here we have the skull, and I'm not going to sit here and point at things and read to you all of these terms. I don't really think that's necessary. Any diagram I give you is fair game for the exam. But for me to just point and go, look, this bone's called this, would be rather pointless. You have the slides, or you have this PowerPoint you can look at as much as you want and study from. So there are a few things within the skull structure that are just generically worth noting. And the first, and almost certainly most important, is an adaptation for the redistribution of mass. You will notice that the beak has no teeth. We know that birds don't have teeth, or at least I would assume we all know that, though their Maniraptoran ancestors did. And the question might be, where did the teeth go? Don't they need to crush their food? And yes, to different extents for different species of birds, but in general, I think it's fair to just say yes, the food must be crushed. And we're going to see exactly where that food crushing capability went at the end of this lecture. But think about why that feature may have evolved in the first place. It's all about the redistribution of mass. It's about moving the center of gravity away from the head. If you are flying, if you imagine a thing flying, the center of gravity should be sort of around the wings. Teeth are quite heavy. When you add a whole bunch of teeth to the head, you add a bunch of weight to the head, you shift the center of gravity forward off the wings, and you have a bird that wants to do flips in the air. That's an exaggeration, of course, but it's a much less efficient form of flight that has to fight the weight of the head the whole time the bird is flying. If you take that weight away, the center of gravity shifts back toward the wings, and flight becomes more energy efficient. So that is one of the big things to notice in the skull. The skull is even more lightened than that, though. Some of the bones that are quite stout in other organisms, and you must understand that in general, the bones that exist in any given skull, like a human skull versus a bird skull, they're the same bones sharing similar ancient origins. Okay, so like we have a frontal region of our skull, we have a parietal region of our skull, etc., just like they do. But if you were to look at, say, our zygomatic arch, which is this little arch over here on the side of your skull, it's a fairly stout structure right here. Okay, the bird's is restricted to a tiny strut, and so their equivalent is this long strut-like bone here. um, that long strut-like bone is much thinner and lighter, and it's just a way to lighten the entire structure. And there are, throughout the palate and uh, various other parts of the bird, reductions in the overall heaviness of these various bone structures into thin strut-like structures to reduce weight and again shift mass backwards, shift the center of mass backwards, closer to the wings. Note the tremendous size of the eye socket. Bird eyes take up a very large percentage of the total real estate of the skull. And vision is very important to birds. Um, and so they've dedicated quite a lot of space to it. Note the brain case region. Now that's not actually literally labeled on here, but I think it's intuitive enough to say, like, well, where does the brain go? It goes here. This is the brain case region behind the eyes. It's relatively not that large of a space to put a brain because we've taken up so much space for the eyes. More so, note the shape of it. The brain, because of the shape and the way this is oriented, the brain is actually tilted inside the skull. It has to tilt back, so it doesn't sit like our brain does in a horizontal position. It sits tilted. And in some birds that we'll look at when we talk about the nervous system next week, you'll see that that can be taken to comical extremes where the brain's practically flipped upside down. It's pretty neat. But then it has, again, it's usually, as in the case of that bird that we'll take a look at, which is the woodcock, uh, it's all reflected in the natural history of the animal, which is so very cool. So, those are some things to note about the skull. The skull is all about eyes, weird tilted brain, and redistribution of mass. That's the big thing, redistribution of mass. So the tongue. So the hyoid apparatus, so like our hyoid apparatus that supports our tongue is this sort of U-shaped bone. In birds, it supports their tongue and is composed of a series of bones. The paraglossal bone is that big triangular bone you see there that makes the tip of the tongue. This is the paraglossal bone. Then you have a basohyal and urohyal bone, and then a ceratobranchial and epibranchial bone. That's a very generic, typical diagram of the bones that support the bird's tongue. And then I have here an acorn woodpecker, and there's a reason for that, because woodpeckers are famous for their tongues. And that might seem silly, but really, if you Google like woodpecker tongue, you're gonna get you see so many cool diagrams that show woodpecker tongues and how long they are and how they work, and it's really quite neat. But this is showing all of those bones right here. You've got your paraglossal, your basohyal, both your ceratobranchial and epibranchials. You see no urohyal bone. They don't have a urohyal bone in woodpeckers. Um, and what happens is these ceratobranchial and epibranchial bones, they come back. So obviously this is the tip of the beak here. They run back and they run all the way underneath and behind the skull, wrap all the way around the skull, and then they insert right at about the tip of the nasal opening right there. And so this bird has a tongue that comes back, it drops underneath the skull, wraps back around the skull, and then all the way to here. And this is I have a really cool example here I usually show when I teach this in a lab where we can literally see these bones. I can't really do that here in an online course. Um, it's a really cool thing to see because it's just like hard to even imagine what this must really look like. It's very neat. If you Google, I know you can find various diagrams that will show this. Actually, I think there's a video of a guy taking he's still got the tongue in a woodpecker's skull and he's pulling it, and you can see the bones, how they shift inside the skull. But what this does is it creates an incredibly long structure that can then stick very far out of the mouth of the woodpecker and probe into cavities for insects. And so something like a northern flicker, for example, you'll see them on the ground and they'll be poking around in the ground, and what they're doing is they're shoving their tongue down into ant nests, and they're pulling ants out with their tongue. Their tongues have uh, a sticky substance on the tip that grabs a hold of ants as it penetrates in through the nest. It also has little inverted barbs on it that grab a hold of stuff as it's pulled back out of the soil, out of the nest, and that's how they eat. That's a really cool mechanism for catching prey that would otherwise be very hard to get to. Excuse me. Um, there's a we might as well talk about this here because I don't know where else we would talk about it, and it's certainly interesting and worth talking about. It's another place where there's some traditional misinformation, and I only very recently learned this myself. There's a paper that came out in 2022, so not that long ago, really, at least as of the time of this recording. Um, and what that paper goes into is the idea of there's historically been this concept that woodpeckers must cushion their brain from the impacts of pecking wood. And this makes so much, this is highly intuitive. This is much like the hollow bone thing. It's highly intuitive. It makes so much sense. Because what a woodpecker is doing when it is pecking wood and chipping through a tree, if you were to do that with your face, not only would you break your face pretty quickly, your brain would turn to mush because your brain would be shaken back and forth in the brain cavity, and just you would be blendering your own brain. You would have severe concussions and permanent brain damage very quickly. And they do this over and over and over and over again at a rapid speed. And so for many, many years, it was thought that there must be a cushioning mechanism that helps protect the brain. One of those proposed cushioning mechanisms was the tongue wrapping around the skull was supposed to give extra support to the skull and reduce the overall forces of the impact. The other is that there's some spongy tissue in the skull, particularly like up toward the front of the skull. It was supposed to act like a cushion for the brain. Well, this paper comes out in 2022 that challenges this idea, and they measure impact force and the forces that are imparted to the brain, and they say it doesn't make evolutionary sense to cushion the blow when the whole point of the blow is to impart optimally efficient damage to the tree, right? You're not gonna, if you're designing something to be a hammer, you're not then going to put a pillow between the hammer and the thing you're trying to hit. That's what they're essentially saying. So if you build these cushioning mechanisms into the apparatus, the hammering apparatus, which is their head, you're reducing the force that's produced ultimately by creating this cushion that is completely contrary to the function of the whole apparatus. It doesn't make any sense. So what they actually found in that paper was that no, the spongy tissue and the tongue bones aren't really doing anything to protect the brain. What really protects the brain, they said, is the tilt of the brain. The way the brain sits in that skull means that it actually overall does not take concussion level forces when the bird is pecking at something. Um, it's and I don't remember the exact figures, but something like about 60% of what would be considered concussion level forces in a human is about where they're at. So they propose then on top of this idea that they're not taking concussion level forces, they also may have repair mechanisms that can deal with the light damage that is dealt to the brain during this activity. And as far as I know, the jury is still out on that particular point. But yeah, the point of all of this is that these aren't really cushioning mechanisms. If you do some research on this, though, you'll see uh, a lot of misinformation about this. And that's just because this paper just came out in 2022. It's been 4 years as of the time of this recording since it came out. And it takes much longer than 4 years for new scientific information to propagate into various forms of media. So that's where we're at with that. That paper is Van Wassenberg et al. 2022. It is cited at all of the papers I'm going to talk about tonight are cited in the on the first slide. Okay. Here we're mostly looking at the rest of the axial skeleton here. We can see all the vertebrae. So this is this model in this book that it uses for this anatomical study is a pigeon. There are different numbers of cervical vertebrae in different species. So 14 is not a set number. But you've got, in this case, 14 cervical vertebrae followed by 5 fused thoracic vertebrae. And you'll see if you look at pictures of thoracic vertebrae, they're all fused into a rigid structure. So again, there's some rigidity. And then you have the the synsacrum, and the synsacrum is made of lumbar, that is abdominal vertebrae, 3 of those, 7 sacral vertebrae, and then 6 of the caudal vertebrae, tailbone vertebrae, that are all fused together into this big plate called the synsacrum. And you can see from this picture here is showing this region of the bird, and you're looking at the synsacrum and the rest of the caudal vertebrae and pygostyle. That's the bones of the tail. It's this big fused plate. So what does that do? Well, it redistributes mass and creates incredible rigidity across this structure. That's what it does. And that's what it's for. These thoracic vertebrae, of course, if you're not familiar at all with the different terminology for vertebrae. So these are the vertebrae that carry with them true ribs. They have true full ribs that are going to wrap around and attach to the sternum. The first two, these two, the last two, cervical vertebrae also have ribs. They have these little cervical ribs that stick out but don't wrap around and connect to the sternum. And then beyond that, there are no ribs. Up here, this is the neck. Another thing just to point out here is this pygostyle. So these caudal vertebrae, the ones that are unfused from the synsacrum, or what is sometimes just called the sacral, sometimes called the synsacral area, sometimes I've heard it called just the sacral area. But these bones that are unfused from the synsacrum. These 6 caudal vertebrae and this pidgestyle make up the bones that are responsible for controlling, that are acting as the muscle anchor points that control the tail feathers. And so they're heavily reduced. This is a place where, like, you can look at the Maniraptor and Ancestor, where you see a full-length bony tail, and you look at these guys and you see that they got rid of that, right? They fused several caudal vertebrae together into this flat pidgestyle, and then they retained only a handful of caudal vertebrae free of the synsacrum, which again redistributes mass. This is, now we're kind of starting to put some other things together. So we've added the ribs on, we've added the sternum and all the bones attached to the sternum, and we're starting to connect pieces together here. And so what we can see here, first off, is we have the scapula. We're looking at this bird from the right side, so its head is facing over this way. And so there's a scapula on this side, and then obviously a mirrored scapula on the other side of the bird. This glenoid fossa is where the humerus, it's the shoulder joint of the bird, is where the humerus is going to attach in. The coracoid bone is another bone, of which there are 2. There's one on either side. Again, because we're looking straight on the right side, we can only see one of them. And you see this coracoid bone meets up with the scapula here, meets with the furcula here. And the furcula is the clavicle. There are 2 bones, just like you have 2 clavicle bones, except for these bones are fused together to make the furcula. And then the coracoid bones come down and they meet at the base of the sternum, and the sternum has this massive keel or carina, this flat blade-like structure, which is not found on all birds, but is found on the vast majority of birds. Flightless birds don't have this because they don't fly. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about some of the things going on here that are particularly interesting. There are really 2 things we can add to talk about in this picture that I think are very interesting. The first is this carina, or sternal keel. What the heck is going on there? Why does that exist? That is a gigantic muscle attachment point. Okay? The most important muscle in flight is the pectoralis major, the muscle that pulls the wing down, that creates the downstroke of the flap, and it's this huge, powerful muscle. When you eat the breast meat of a turkey or a chicken, you're eating the pectoralis major. Okay, you're eating that big flight muscle. And birds that have to have very powerful takeoffs, like galliform birds, right, have very large pectoralis muscles, and that's why we like to eat them. The the sternum then is a giant muscle attachment point for the pectoralis and another muscle called the supracoracoideus muscle. We will take a look at the supracoracoideus and what it does when we look at the muscles here in a little bit. But it is a much smaller muscle that attaches to the keel as well, but lays underneath of the massive pectoralis muscle. Its mechanism is extremely cool. It's one of my very favorite things to talk about in avian anatomy. It's just really neat. I keep forgetting which screen I need to point at. So the ribs also have something really cool going on. They have these uncinate processes. The uncinate processes add rigidity. They create an interlocking cage out of the ribs, right? Instead of the ribs being fully independent, any one rib here that gets, say, collapsed inward will be supported by an adjacent rib. So they create rigidity. They also create an extensive region of muscle attachment. Um, and this is important for some of the muscles that are associated with respiration. And this is reflected in the anatomies of various birds. Birds such as diving birds, which have some very specific sorts of respiratory demands, have very long onset processes. And birds which have, say, like walking birds, which have much lower respiratory requirements, have much shorter onset processes. So these processes add rigidity to the rib structure and also act as muscle attachment points that support respiration. All right, here we've just tilted the bird at an angle so you can see some of the same structures we were just looking at in 3 dimensions. So you can see how the coracoid and how the furcula in particular, what they really look like when you can see both sides of the bird. And so you can see you've got 2 clavicle bones. These are fused together. They create the furcula. And for those of you who are familiar with the Thanksgiving tradition where you take the wishbone out of the turkey, some of you may have done this. I used to do this with my grandma when she was still around. We would take the wishbone out of the turkey at Thanksgiving, and both people pull on one end, one of the 2 clavicle bones, and then whoever gets the longer half gets to make a wish. It's an old Thanksgiving tradition. I don't know how many people do that anymore, but that's all this is. This big U or wishbone-shaped structure is the furcula, and the furcula is a pretty cool structure that we'll talk about more. I think probably when we talk about respiration. The coracoid are these 2 big stout bones that meet up with the clavicles or the furcula and the scapula, and they form this triosseal canal, a canal of 3 bones. So it's a little opening here. That triosseal canal is going to be very important because a muscle is going to run through that canal that's going to be important for lifting the wing up in flight. Not creating the downstroke, but creating the upstroke of flight. And we'll look at how that works here. We're going to revisit this exact same figure in a few slides from now, but we'll see a muscle attached to it, the supracoracoideus, and we'll see how it all works. Okay, let's move on. Finally, the appendages, the legs and the wings. What can we see in the legs and the wings? Well, first, let's take a look at, this is the right leg here. And one of the things we see is when we number the digits, the first digit is the halix or hallux. That's the toe that is facing back in most birds. Now, there are a number of types of dactyly in birds, like zygodactyl and isodactyl and such. Your book goes into all of those, and they're very cool and worth talking about. So make sure you look at that part of the book. Well, make sure you read the whole book, but the whole chapter. But that's the first digit, and you count from there. You count inward, outward. So this innermost toe here is the second, and then the third and the fourth as you come toward the outside of the leg. This tarsometatarsus is a fusion of the first through third metatarsal bones. It is the foot. Birds walk on their toes. They are digitigrade animals. They walk on their toes. And so this is typically, we just call it the tarsus out in the field when we're banding a bird. We band, the tarsus of the bird. This is where you put the bird band. It's the foot. Excuse me. Okay, so it's the foot of the bird. And then the rest of this is fairly straightforward. The tibia, tarsus, fibula, and the femur. These are not too wildly different from anything that you might normally see. But here, so this is the knee, right? This is the knee. And right here is where you expect the foot to be, but you don't expect it to have this whole other long bone sticking up. Well, that's because the foot is fused into this long bone up for a digitigrade foot. It creates this weird, when you see a bird in the field, if you hold a bird and you're not looking and feeling closely, the femur is fairly short, and a lot of birds, when you're holding them and you're looking at the legs, you don't really see the femur. It's covered in feathers. And you see this, and it looks like their knee is facing backwards. That's very much so what it intuitively looks like. But that's just not the case. The knee's way up here. This is not the knee. This is the ankle. Yeah, so this is not the ankle. This is just where the toes are connecting to the rest of the foot. So that's one thing. And this structure, and this elongate tarsometatarsals, and and how this articulates right here is actually pretty important in passerine birds because it affects their automatic perching ability, which we'll talk about with mussels. So that's pretty cool. Um, Other than that, let's take a look now at the wing. These bones, just like these bones, all have the same. These are the same exact skeletal terms that apply for the most part in a human, other than some of the terms associated with fused structures. And it's the same thing here. For the most part, these terms are very, very similar to the terms of a human skeletal anatomy or any other skeletal anatomy. So things like the humerus. You have a humerus. The radius and ulna. You have that as well. The things to look at in the wing that are very interesting are, one, the humerus is short, stout, and very powerful. It is where the muscle attachment for the pectoralis major is. The pectoralis major pulls on the humerus to pull the wing down. And in fact, the supracoracoideus, as we'll see, pulls on the humerus to lift the wing up. So the humerus takes the muscular forces and applies them to the whole wing. And so it must be a very powerful bone. But what I really want to look at is out here. A couple things. The carpometacarpus, this is the fusion of the first, second, and third carpals. These are all fused to create a very rigid structure that can take the demands of flight, because you've got the pressure generated by lift pushing up on the tip of the wing, and it's quite a bit of force that has to be able to withstand. So they're fused together for that purpose. Note the digits here, particularly note the first digit. This first digit is very interesting because if you think about the feathers and you can picture how the feathers are laid out over the wing, you might notice that right here there are a couple feathers that are very, very important. The alula feathers. So this is sort of the thumb of the bird. Right, so if you imagine, I'm going to try to do this in the camera. I don't know if my camera's working right now. It's been a little fussy lately. But if you imagine a wing like this, right, you've got the humerus, radius and ulna, and then all of your carpometacarpus and your digits. The thumb is right here, and it adjusts the alula feathers. The first digit adjusts the alula feathers. Now in birds, that first digit is a fusion of two different phalange bones. But nonetheless, it's like a little, it's the support point for the alula feathers. This is kind of neat. So yeah, those are the big things. You've got the fusion and rigidity at the end of the wing in the manus for the carpometacarpus. You've got the alula support in the first digit, and then you've got that very stout humerus. So that's an overview of the muscular system. I'm sorry, of the skeletal system. Now we'll move on to the muscular system. The next two sections are much shorter. I'm just going to point out some very particular things I think are important or interesting. um, One of the most important groups of muscles are the muscles of the neck, and there is a very good reason for that. When you think about, well, first, what do muscles do? Muscles they interact with bones to create motion, right? The skeleton by itself doesn't do anything, and muscles by themselves don't really do anything either. A muscle must pull on a skeletal element to create motion. Um, if I want to move my arm like this, a bicep must pull on the bones of my arm, my forearm actually, pull on these bones to create lift. Um, and either thing by itself doesn't do anything. So the muscles create motion in the body. The muscles in the neck of a bird are very elaborate. There are tons of small, intricate muscles. Um, and there's a reason that has to happen. Because birds are lacking something that we have that we use to manipulate things. They don't have it. Hands. We have hands, which makes us able to easily pick things up, move things around. If I want to, if I cared to weave a basket, I could do that very easily with my hands and some training. Well, birds have to weave, in many cases, nests. Not all birds do that, but just as an example. They don't have hands to do that. How do they do it? They do it with their faces. They do it with their beaks. And so that means that they must have very intricate control over their necks, which means they have to have a very complex musculature. And that's what you can see in this picture. The various muscles that permit the uh, highly precise uh, movements of the neck and head. Now, there's another reason that these muscles are complex. Not only is the bird using its mouth, its face, um, like a hand in many instances, the eyes of the very great majority of birds, at least, can't move around in their sockets. I can look at this computer screen and look to my right and look to my left and see things without moving my head. Birds can't do that. Most of them cannot do that. Some of them have some limited ability to move their eyes around in their sockets, but that's not the standard form. Um, and so to make up for that, to increase range of vision, or field of vision, I should say, I'm sorry, uh, they have to be able to move their heads further than we can move our heads. So we're going to talk in more detail about this when we get to talking about field of vision in the nervous system. But in general, birds' field of vision, for many birds, is actually superior to our own, simply because they can move their neck further around than we can. Even though we can move our eyes, they're able to rotate their neck more, so their field of view is greater. And then additionally, you have, and this is a cool example from a pigeon, you have cutaneous muscles. These are very superficial muscles. These thin cutaneous muscles lift the feathers. One might ask, why would you want to lift your feathers up on your neck? Well, if you've ever watched a male pigeon trying to be its sexiest and attract a female, you will see a part of their little dance that they do involves fluffing out the neck feathers, looking real sexy with their necks all fluffed out. And so they use those cutaneous muscles to do that. So there's uh, a reproductive function as well. um, Other muscles. These are the only other muscles we're going to talk about. Just a few other big things. Let's do the one on the left first, because we've already seen we've taken a good look at these skeletal structures, I think, and I've already hinted as to what's happening in this picture. So remember on this, the keel of the sternum, Sorry. Recall on the keel of the sternum here, you have massive muscle attachment. You have the pectoralis muscle, pectoralis major, and it reaches straight up, runs across this face of the coracoid, grabs the bottom of the humerus, and it pulls it down with tremendous force to create the downstroke of flight. The thin supracoracoideus muscle lies underneath of it, and so here we've pulled all the pectoralis is not showing. We're looking beneath the pectoralis muscle, and you can see exactly what the supracoracoideus does. It runs up the coracoid, wraps around the back, and it comes through the triosseal canal. That's the little hole here, um, and then it grabs the humerus from above, but its origin is below. This is cool. It is a muscle that exists below a structure that lifts the structure up. It's a rather unusual mechanism. Um, and what we have here is a pulley. This is literally a muscular pulley. So this wraps around, and as this tightens, it pulls on the humerus and lifts the humerus up, and creating the upstroke of the wing. The diagram on the right here showing the leg, there's one thing in particular that's quite important. That's this flexor digitorum longus, and it's associated. Oh, what's the word I'm looking for? I've lost the word. Tendon, the associated tendon. Jeez. Um, what this does, this is kind of cool. We have what's called in passerine birds the automatic digital flexor mechanism, which is an automatic perching mechanism. Okay, what happens is if you look at this flexor digitorum longus, it reaches down here, and it is responsible for pulling these digits closed. If you're a perching bird and you sleep sitting in a tree, you probably don't want to expend tons of energy keeping that muscle flexed all the time. Intuitively, that would just seem a waste of, that's a lot of energy to spend just to sit in a tree, having a permanent muscle flexion. So how can we do that without spending a bunch of energy to flex that muscle? Well, the way we do that has to do with the ratio of the length of this tarsometatarsus to the tibia, tarsus, and fibula here, and how this wraps around this articulation between the tarsometatarsus and these bones. And so if you imagine this leg closing, imagine the bird's, its butt is coming down, the knee is moving forward, and this articulation is moving this way. It stretches the flexor digitorum longus, and that automatically, without spending energy, just the pressure that's created here stretches that muscle and pulls the toes closed. So a perching bird will land on a branch, and as it can flex it manually, to grip the branch, but as it sits its little butt down to rest, those toes will automatically close around the branch without expending energy. So that's what the automatic digital flexor mechanism is. Now, the interesting thing, so there's an experiment done by Galton and Shepard in 2012 where they looked at starlings, which are a type of perching bird. And they said, well, starlings, they don't bend their legs much when they're at rest. They still have, they still have a fairly upright leg posture. So one might hypothesize that they're not using this mechanism. And so they did a bunch of experiments on these birds, on starlings. One of the things they did was actually just they cut the tendon. and they found that the birds were still able to do from like a resting position. They were still able to mechanically rest just the same. And because what they do is they actually, the way the pad of the foot is it sits like a cradle over the over the branch, and they actually just balance their bodies over the branch. So not all perching birds use this automatic digital flexor mechanism, but many are thought to use this mechanism. It really depends on if the bird at rest sits down in like bends its legs enough to trigger the mechanism. All right, I need to take a very quick drink again. Oh, my drink came with a fruit fly. That's nice. Let's get that out of there. Okay, the digestive system. So this is the last system for this lecture, and then the rest of the systems that I want to talk about separately from the book material will go into the next lecture. So digestive system. We have really only this is the whole diagram right here, and so how does the digestive system function? I mean, in general, what's it do? Well, it takes food, it processes it, breaks it down, extracts all the good, nutritious information, and expels the waste. That's what it does. How does it do that? Well, it differs in different birds, and we'll compare that in a minute. But we start up here at the esophagus. The esophagus is a generally fairly flexible tube that can take in fairly large food and temporarily expand to permit that food to go through it. Remember, this food is not being chewed, it's being swallowed essentially whole because there are no teeth to chew. And so it must be able to take in and expand to permit unchewed food to move through it. And in some birds, a part of the esophagus will be expanded into a storage sac called a crop, where food can be held. So, for example, a bird might grab some seeds, fly to a safe place to eat or to digest, and then finish the digestive process once it's in a safe place. And it can do that by storing things in the crop. So the crop is a storage mechanism. And there are various reasons that birds do this. You've got this storage sac in some birds. And then you have this expansive tube that is mostly the proventriculus. Some of this is esophagus, but eventually you get into the proventriculus. And once you're in the proventriculus, you're in the stomach. The stomach is the proventriculus and the ventriculus together. The ventriculus in birds is usually just called the gizzard. So this is what we're zoomed in on over here, the proventriculus and ventriculus or gizzard. And the proventriculus, what it does is it produces digestive enzymes that are going to break food down. Things like hydrochloric acid are produced here to help start really breaking down food. So it's a chemical, it's a highly glandular tissue on the inner lining that produces these chemicals to break down food. And that food travels into this gizzard. Now, we'll talk about modifications to this. This is using the pigeon as a model for understanding this. This is highly modified in different species. But in something like a pigeon, which has to grind seeds down, this gizzard is an incredibly thickly muscled structure with sandpaper-like interior cutica gastrica, which is just to say the inner cuticle. And that inner cuticle is constantly being replenished as it wears down, it's constantly grinding things. And these birds will also swallow small stones and hold them in the gizzard that help even further grind things down. So you've got chemical and then physical uh, processing going on in the stomach to break the food down. The gizzard is really the replacement for teeth. We don't have teeth to do the mechanical grinding, so we have to replace that with a gizzard, and that is how we move the mass requirement from the tip of the head down into the body, closer to the center of gravity that we want around the wings. Um, so that's the stomach, the proventriculus and the ventriculus. We then move into the small intestine. The small intestine is where nutrient absorption occurs. It's so picking nutrients up into the bloodstream and fats into the lymphatic system, and it is made up of three parts that you can see there: the duodenum, the jejunum, and ileum, and ultimately it ends in the colic caecae, um, of which, or caecae, I should say, uh, of which are of various designs. They can be quite elaborate and large. They can be small. They can be non-existent. It really depends on the bird. Um, but what they are is they hold material for bacterial digestion and basically support bacteria of the gut that help the birds absorb nutrients. So they're like little bacteria houses. I think that's kind of how you can think of them. So you have, the nutrient absorption happening. Now you see the liver and also the gallbladder is involved in this, and the bile ducts coming from the liver. So the liver is one of the things the liver does, is it provides this bile and it helps neutralize the acidity. The bile is alkaline, so it helps neutralize the acidity coming in from the proventriculus and gizzard. It also, at the same time, breaks down fat. Additionally, the liver has other functions that aren't related to the breakdown of materials within the small intestine. So it produces, or I should say, it processes various digestive products to make all sorts of materials that are beneficial to the body, and it neutralizes harmful substances in the blood as well. So it does a bunch of different things. At the same time here, what else? So we got the pancreas. Let's look at the pancreas. So the pancreas is, it produces things like insulin and glucagon, but it also produces digestive enzymes that are helpful in further processing food to be digested and for nutrients to be absorbed in the small intestine. And then eventually, when we get through the entire very long small intestine, we get to the large intestine, which is very short. So that's not intuitive. You're like, why is the small intestine long and the large intestine short? It has to do with the diameter of the structures. That is, how big around the tube is, not how long it is. So it's small because it's narrow. This is large because it's less narrow. When you get down here, at this point in the large intestine, mostly what's happening is any remaining water that can be reabsorbed gets reabsorbed. So we can save as much water as possible, and the final waste gets passed to the cloaca. That's the you can think of it like the anus, but that's really overly simplifying what is happening at the cloaca. The cloaca is an all-purpose hole. It does all of the things, and so it is where waste products, both solid and liquid waste products, are excreted, as well as where reproduction takes place. Everything is connected to this one singular opening. So that's the cloaca. And I think we'll talk more about that when we talk about reproductive system stuff. Some cool things to talk about with digestion, things that we can associate the digestive system with natural history of certain bird species. So if we look at something like a red-tailed hawk, but really any raptors, also swifts, passerines, and some other groups of birds do this as well. Many birds produce pellets. Pellets are in the gizzard undigestible material, and those pellets build up and digestion gets complete, and then maybe several hours later the bird regurgitates the pellet. It was what you would call casting. We often say it casts the pellet, and that's what's happening in this picture. It's throwing up, this red-tailed hawk is throwing up this pellet, it's casting this pellet. Okay. So that's what's happening there. Many birds do that. Birds that eat a lot of insects, for example, like if you're a swift, there are pieces of the exoskeleton and things that aren't really going to be very easily dealt with. The exoskeleton itself not really digestible, so you can form a pellet of this material and regurgitate it, so you don't have to try to pass what would probably be the equivalent of trying to pass chunks of hard plastic for a human. Not a very fun time. So some birds have an incredibly reduced gizzard, and this is just a cool comparison of this idea. Here on the left, you've got an evening grosbeak. Evening grosbeaks have pretty substantial gizzards. Most grosbeaks do is they have to break down fairly substantial, heavily coated seeds, and they need a gizzard to help do that process. But here on the right, you have an elegant euphonia. This is a species that eats primarily berries. So think about what that means in terms of the demands on the digestive system. There's almost no demand for powerful grinding to crush a berry. They're soft. So the only thing that's left, if you look at the proventriculus and ventriculus of the elegant euphonia, the only thing that's left is this tiny little nubbin sticking off the side of the proventriculus. That's all that's left of the gizzard or the ventriculus in this species. This is a vestigial character. It's no longer, we're not really doing anything. And so this is a great example of how we can see in the digestive system a reflection of the natural history of these species. The spruce grouse. Well, the spruce grouse is a bird that mostly eats conifer needles, and they are not particularly nutritious. They're, the nutrient quality, they're highly fibrous and of poor nutrient quality. So to maximize the extraction of nutrient material that is in the food they're eating, they have an extremely elongate small intestine. So their small intestine is very, very long. Other birds have much, much shorter small intestines. It's just to go to show that within these anatomical structures, you can see something again about the natural history of the animal. And then the last thing I want to talk about, just fairly briefly, is the Watson from South America. And it's a particularly unusual bird. It's one of the coolest birds on the planet. Beautiful, striking bird. It eats leaves. It spends all of its time in the canopy. Not a particularly great flyer. They are very weird. They're entire stomach is reduced because they eat the same way a cow does. Cows are gut fermenters. They hold material in their gut and they let it just sit in there and ferment. In other words, they let bacteria help break stuff down. Watsons do the same thing. Um, their crop is very, very enlarged. It acts as a fermentation chamber. So they just eat some leaf material and it sits and it just slowly ferments through bacterial fermentation. And that's how they break their food down. This is a very slow process. So their digestive timeline is much different than typical. It takes many, 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 many hours for them to digest that material relative to what any other bird would have to do. But it's another very interesting example of an adaptation. This bird essentially is a tree cow. Obviously, TM. That's I made that up. But that's basically what it is. It's a cow in a tree. It's not a cow at all. It's a bird, but that's how it lives. It grazes on leaves and just sort of hangs out in trees. Very cool digestive system. Okay, so we talked about aspects of the skeletal, muscular, and digestive systems, and how those aspects reflect the natural histories of species. Um, I hope this was interesting to you. It's actually one of my favorite subjects, even though the anatomical terminology I know is unattractive until you've familiarized yourself with it. Um, and I'm looking forward to doing the second lecture, hopefully without this COVID voice, um, next week. If you have any questions, please reach out to me.